Good afternoon. Hello, I'm Halie Soifer, CEO of the Jewish Democratic Council of America, and I want to thank you for joining today's conversation, Jewish Conservatives for Kamala, hosted by JDCA. JDCA serves as the home and voice for all Jewish voters, advocating on behalf of Democratic candidates who share our values. While our name may suggest we are just Jewish Democrats, we recognize the growing number of independent voters in our community, and we aim and strive to be a political home for all. So whether you're a Democrat or an independent or a Republican, we welcome you to JDCA with open arms and hope that in return, you're here today with an open heart and open ears. With just 3 weeks and 1 day until Election Day, we at JDCA are doing all we can to mobilize the Jewish vote in support of Kamala Harris and other Democrats who share our values. And we're grateful to be joined by thousands of you across the country, making calls, sending texts, and knocking on doors. We've totaled nearly 1.5 million direct voter contacts so far this cycle and are on track to exceed 2 million. And we encourage you all to join us in these final 3 weeks. At the doors and on the phones, we're finding a range of Jewish voters. Nearly 3 out of 4 of us are supporting Kamala Harris and Democrats, but that support is not something we can take for granted. We know there are undecided Jewish voters, and there are leaners, those who are either leaning towards supporting Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, but have not fully committed. And we want to make sure that those voters especially make their decision at the ballot box based on the facts and not disinformation that has crept into our political discourse. Because let's face it, this is not a typical election. Donald Trump isn't a typical candidate. He's an aspiring, self-proclaimed dictator on day one, who's repeatedly denigrated millions of us, American Jews supporting Democrats, and has collectively blamed and scapegoated the Jewish people for a possible election loss. He and his supporters have also trafficked in lies, including about Kamala Harris's record on a range of issues, including Iran, anti-Semitism, and Israel. And again, it's important that Jewish voters head to the polls with the truth. So in order to do so today, we want to bring you a range of voices and views, and we're thrilled to be joined by 2 esteemed Jewish conservatives, both of whom worked in Republican administrations, who will share why they are supporting Vice President Harris and why other Jewish conservatives should as well. Electing Kamala Harris this November is not just a priority for Jewish voters. It must be a priority for all Americans who care about the future of our democracy, our freedoms, our national security, rule of law, and yes, the safety and security of American Jews and the U.S.-Israel relationship. But don't take my word for it. Take that of our guests. So to make the conservative case for Kamala Harris, I'm pleased to welcome Bill Kristol and Dr. Eliot Cohen. There will be time for audience questions, so please post them in the chat. And to introduce our speakers and our moderator, Sarah Cohn, I'm thrilled to welcome our board member, Lynn Schreier. Lynn.
Thanks, Halie. Bill Kristol is a political commentator and former chief of staff to President Dan Quayle. A lifelong Republican, Kristol has spoken out against Donald Trump and is actively supporting Kamala Harris's presidential campaign. He hosts the podcast Conversations with Bill Kristol and serves as the editor-at-large for The Bulwark, an online magazine defending democracy in the U.S. Dr. Eliot Cohen is a political scientist with expertise in international defense and security. During the George W. Bush administration, he served as counselor to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. He has been teaching at Johns Hopkins University since 1990 and also writes for The Atlantic and co-hosts a podcast on The Bulwark. Our discussion today will be moderated by Sarah Cohn, former chief speechwriter for Israel's ambassador to the UN. Sarah has also served as chief of staff to the chief rabbi of the United Arab Emirates and worked on presidential campaigns of Hillary Clinton and President Joe Biden. Sarah is heavily involved with Jewish Women for Kamala and works on a team of Jewish speechwriters writing surrogate op-eds for the Harris campaign. Thank you all so much for being here, and I am pleased to turn things over to Sarah to begin the conversation. Sarah?
Thank you so much, Lynn, and thank you to JDCA for hosting us today for such an important conversation. And of course, thank you to Eliot and thank you to Bill for being here. As Halie mentioned, neither of you is here as a representative of JDCA, the Democratic Party, or Democrats in general. So before we get into the specific issues, I think we'd all like to know, as lifelong conservatives, how did you get here? Bill, we'll start with you.
Yeah. Well, it's good to be with you all, and thank you for the introductions. And it's great to be here with Eliot, very old and dear friend. Sorry, so I'll just say a word. I'm not quite a lifelong Republican, as Lynn said. I worked for Pat Moynihan in 1976 in his primary campaign against Bella Abzug, in which actually support for Israel was a huge issue. Abzug Jewish and had many Jewish supporters, but actually had not been traditionally a Zionist and a supporter of Israel. And before that, I had been a volunteer when I was an undergraduate for Scoop Jackson, the great Cold War Democrat and a great friend of Israel and of Jewish refuseniks from the Soviet Union, early human rights advocate, as part of a hawkish foreign policy. I always say that was the beginning of my very successful political career, handing out leaflets for Scoop Jackson in Massachusetts in 1972. I think he ran 6th in that primary behind Wilbur Mills, and I've gone from one losing campaign to another. Basically, Moynihan was the one exception. He won by 1%. This is kind of amazing. Moynihan, who had such a distinguished career as a senator, was a senator because he won by 1% of the vote over Bella Abzug in the primary in 76 in New York, which is a good reminder for 2024. These elections are more often than one thinks decided by a surprisingly small percentage of the vote. And this is where Jewish vote is not huge, but Jewish voters are in some key states, and a small movement can make a big difference for them and for others who are pro-Israel and anti-Semitism. So I'm pleased to be here. Once Trump got the nomination in 2016, I haven't voted for a Republican since. I think he's really a terrible person, but more importantly, a very dangerous person to have as president. And I thought he was dangerous before his first term. He was dangerous during his first term. I was happy and played a tiny part in helping President Biden beat him in 2020. He supported President Biden. But I think the only point I'll make is that people are underestimating how dangerous a second term of Trump will be, much more than the first term, where the guardrails, people whom Eliot and I have known well, Eliot more than me probably in the foreign policy world, were able to restrain some of what Trump wanted to do. And the establishment was still there. It was still there somewhat in the Congress. The degree to which the authoritarianism is just unmasked, and therefore the America First agenda is unmasked and full throttle in a Trump second term, really makes him, in my view, the most dangerous candidate we've had for president in modern American history.
Eliot, we'll turn to you.
So I was a Republican for a long time, although I was an independent before that. But what I've always been is a conservative, even as a young man. I've served. Well, I guess one thing I should probably begin with is, like Bill, we're very much an identified Jewish family. We belong to an Orthodox synagogue. I went to a Hebrew day school. My kids went to Hebrew day schools, and now I'm glad to say their kids go to Hebrew day schools. So we're quite firmly rooted in the Jewish world. And I should also say, with a deep connection to Israel, I'll be heading there in a few weeks for a conference with a group of senior Israeli military and intelligence officials. So I know that many in the audience will be concerned about where the candidates stand on Israel, and I think I can speak pretty knowledgeably about Israeli security, having been there a lot and even written a book or two about it. For me, the breaking point was 2016, and I was a Republican. I had served in the George H.W. Bush administration in the Department of Defense. I was the deputy director of the policy planning staff, and then, of course, later on in the State Department as the counselor of the State Department. In late 2015 and then 2016, as it was clear that Trump was going to be the nominee, I helped write one letter and then edited a second of Republican national security officials opposed to Trump. So I'm like Bill, I'm one of the founding members of the Never Trump Club. And I think that the key thing that I would say is that at the heart of both of those letters, and at the heart of a letter that a number of us have recently signed again, we're setting aside differences over policy, because I'm not really sure Trump has a view on policy per se. It was the character of the man that terrified us, the kinds of things that he said, what his record was, the lack of integrity, the manifest narcissism, all of which has become a lot worse. And that for me is at the heart of it. And I think one of the foolish arguments is to say, well, he'll be good for Israel. Trump intends only, I think, to be good for himself. And people who've worked with him say that. People like John Bolton said, don't count on him being supportive of Israel. And I think that's right. I mean, he is a malignant narcissist. I very much agree with my old friend Bill about the people who would be around him. I mean, even make the comparison between a Mike Pence and a J.D. Vance. And I understand for many of the people out there, Mike Pence might not be your cup of tea, but he's a far less menacing figure than J.D. Vance was. And then, in the upshot, he did the right thing in terms of helping to certify the election. I don't think J.D. Vance would do that. And in fact, J.D. Vance has consorted with people like Tucker Carlson who traffic in anti-Semitic tropes. I knew most of the senior people went into the first run of the Trump administration, people like Jim Mattis, who I've known for a very, very long time during his military career and afterwards. Those are not the people who are going to be around Trump in his second administration. And I think one of the other dangers in all this that Bill was alluding to is when Trump went in the first time, he did not know how to operate the levers of government. And the people around him also, because they had almost no experience, didn't know what you could do with government. I think for those of us who've been in and have a sense of what the opportunities are for the abuse of power, Trump is a pretty terrifying figure. Now, let me also say something about Kamala Harris, because I'm not, the truth is I'm supporting Kamala Harris in large part because I'm terrified of what a Trump presidency would mean. But I feel quite comfortable supporting the vice president on a number of grounds. First, I think she has a moral center. I think people have sometimes complained about her positions. Vice presidents don't get to articulate their own policies. So that troubles me less. But what I think is clear about her is the kind of core that results from her having been a prosecutor, and her sense of the difference between perpetrators and victims. And where that really comes out, we may want to discuss this a little bit later, Sarah, is in the letter that she sent out on October 7th, which was, I thought, an extraordinarily powerful statement. It is the statement of somebody with a moral center who keenly felt what the horrors of that day were. And, that reassures me. She's a reassuring figure. If she's elected, look, both Bill and I will probably, beginning sometime in late January, be criticizing the policies of the administration. But the point is, it's well within the norm. It's not somebody who I think has the, profound lack of character that Donald Trump has. So I'm quite happy to be here with you all.
Thank you so much, Eliot. And actually, you just started to talk about my next question, so this is great. I'd love to dive into Israel. So last week, we marked the one-year anniversary of October 7th, which we all know was the most horrific tragedy against the Jewish people, arguably since the Holocaust. Eliot, you were just talking about this strong statement, this letter that the vice president had put out after October 7th, and how it was particularly impressive and meaningful in terms of where she came down on the issue. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that statement, but also in the broader context of kind of what gives you confidence that the Harris-Walz ticket is the right choice when it comes to Israel, particularly in the post-October 7th era. And we'll start with Eliot and then Bill, if you'd like to respond as well after.
So I led a small delegation of military and national security experts to Israel in early December of last year. And among other things, we toured the Gaza envelope. We went to Kibbutz Be'eri and Kibbutz Nir Oz, and those were horrifying sights. But the most horrifying thing we saw was this video that the Israelis have put together, taken exclusively from body cameras and closed-circuit TV and dash cams, and notably video that was taken on mobile phones, to some extent by victims before they were killed, and to a remarkable extent by perpetrators who were happy about what they were doing. It's a 47-minute video. You should not see it unless you have to, for some professional reason. I felt I had to. The most horrible thing I've ever seen in my life, and I've seen a lot of horrible things, some in person when I was going to Iraq and Afghanistan, when I was in the government, some because, like many Jews, I'm quite familiar with the Holocaust. My wife worked for a long time at the Holocaust Museum. This is the most horrible video I've ever seen. And I literally could not sleep for 2 weeks after watching it. One of the hallmarks of it was the degree of sexual violence that was used. And I'm not going to go into the grisly details. Let me just say this was not people slipping out of control. And it wasn't simply rape. It was torture of a particularly fiendish kind. Now, lead that back to Kamala Harris. The thing that struck me about her statement is the second line was rape. She called it what it was, not sexual violence. She just said rape. And it's very clear that she feels that. I think she arranged a screening of this new film that was made specifically about rape as a part of that. And I thought, okay, that was a window into her character. But by contrast, by the way, Trump, he went to some sort of observance. Didn't issue any statement, and I don't know whether these things even register with him or not. But that when I read that statement, I said, okay, she gets it at a visceral level. Now, in terms of to step back a bit and think about what the sort of the policy issues are. Although I have some reservations about the Biden administration's policy towards Israel, on the whole, you have to say that they've done a remarkable job. If you look at the quantities of arms that were shipped there, if you look at Biden's visit himself, and I've been extremely critical of President Biden in other respects, that was a remarkable thing. I don't think Donald Trump would do that. And I think they have shown support, particularly given the fact that in their own constituency, there are loud voices that are very anti-Israel. And of course, I'm thinking about the campuses. The problem that American Jews face in our October 8th reality, let's call it that, is a rise in particularly rabid anti-Semitism on the margins of both left and right. We saw that with Tucker Carlson. We've seen that with others. We even see a bit of that with Trump, when he says, well, if I lose, it's going to be the Jews' fault, which is a pretty menacing sort of trope. And so I admire politicians who have the guts to take an unequivocal stand, even if it may cost them some votes in Dearborn, Michigan. And the last thing, and I'll then pass it off to Bill, one of the things that struck me about that statement is, if you look at a lot of the statements that have been issued by university presidents in particular, there's a lot of equivalence. You can't say anti-Semitism without saying Islamophobia. And that wasn't what came out of the vice president's office. This was a statement about anti-Semitism. It was a statement about October 7th. And that gives me some confidence too. And, you can never tell exactly what a president is going to do. I've become more of an historian than a political scientist, so I know that. But I have infinitely more confidence in Kamala Harris than I do in Donald Trump.
Thank you, Eliot. Bill, I'd love to turn it over to you for some comments.
Eliot said everything very well, and I associate myself with what he said, and I don't need to repeat it. I'll just add one point. Trump, much more than he was in 2016, 2017. Well, in 2016, he appropriated the term America First. I remember him tossing it out at some press conference or something, I think at Trump Tower, actually. I remember being really shocked thinking, well, of course, he doesn't know what that is. He doesn't know what the actual organization was. Someone told him the phrase. It sounds good to him because he wants to be a nationalist and, as not quote, not a globalist and all that stuff. And he doesn't appreciate what America First really was and what its legacy is and what it means to people today. And I think I was a little wrong on that, actually. I don't know if he really did know, or once he knew, it certainly didn't bother him. And he's now totally all in on the phrase, obviously. This is the defining phrase of his foreign policy, just like, containment would have been for other, earlier presidents, for Harry Truman or something like that, right? And I think the selection of Vance as vice president is very important in that respect. Vance is really all in on America First and has, knows much more than Trump and has not shied away from that movement at all. And that was a terrible movement in terms of its understanding of the world. Just for a quick refresher course, that's funny. I assumed back 10 years ago, I hadn't had much occasion to think I'd read that much about, America First. It was kind of something in history, right? And I kind of assumed it was left over from the mid 30s. It was kind of an isolationism that came out of the reaction to World War I. It was foolish and irresponsible, but it wasn't necessarily that malevolent. Maybe at the end it became a little more that way. America First was founded in September 1940, the America First Committee. It was founded after Hitler had invaded Poland and divided it up with Stalin, after the fall of France, during the Battle of Britain, after it was perfectly clear what Hitler was intending with his conquest of Europe. And it was founded nonetheless to keep us out of the war and to apologize really for German and Nazi actions. And it was anti-Semitic in many ways. Famously, Lindbergh said, there's a phrase he used, a kind of a subversive group here in America trying to get us in the war for their own reasons. It was really malevolent. It was discredited finally by Pearl Harbor and went out of business. And decent people who were involved in it as very young men sort of apologized later on, regretted that they had been part of it. But this is what Trump and Vance, but Vance is for it. I mean, he knows what he's for. And I think the most interesting indication of it, and this is related to Israel, is when the vote came up for aid to Israel and Ukraine packaged together, as most foreign aid bills are, aid for Israel is packaged in broader foreign aid legislation. That's the routine thing every year anyway. Vance voted against it. He cares so much about America First, and he so much dislikes helping Ukraine, which from my point of view is an extremely just and important cause for the future of the world, that he won't, that he says he's, well, if the Israel thing had been by itself, he would have been okay with it. He couldn't vote for it. And think about that for a minute. Think how telling that is. He says Israel is important to him, but if it means violating some other aspect of his America First policy, he won't do it. And that, I think, is going to be the Trump-Vance administration. And the people who are going to be in there, just can't emphasize this enough, are going to be, they're not going to be the people we saw in the first term, even late in the first term, when it had gone downhill quite a bit. It's going to be the people who Trump tried to put in after November 3rd. And they are both ideologues and reckless and irresponsible. And in that respect, the notion of the Trump-Vance administration, maybe Trump personally has some attachments to Israel because of family, or because he has longtime business associates who are Jewish and somewhat pro-Israel. But none of that can be counted on in the second term, partly because he's Trump and he's erratic and it's all transactional. And as we saw with the statement, that, well, he's not going to be very pleased if the Jews don't vote for him because he's done so much for them. What does that apply? So much for the depth of his commitment to Israel, or to the Jews. But leaving even that aside, I think an America First foreign policy would be bad for Israel. It may not be bad for Israel on day one, it's not like but it will be bad for Israel over 4 years, and could be. I hope it wouldn't be. If it were to win, I guess we would all have to work hard to try to make it not as bad as it could be, but it's going to be bad, and dangerous and very risky, and so I think, just to compliment Eliot's sort of on the positive side of Vice President Harris, I'd say the risk of the Trump-Vance administration for Israel should not be underestimated.
Thank you both. So I'd like to turn, so both of you sort of touched on this a little bit. Trump supporters often, cite different things about why he's, quote, good for Israel. They cite the Abraham Accords. They cite moving the embassy. They say his daughter, his son-in-law, his grandchildren are Jewish, and therefore he will care more about Israel. Why is this a false sense of security? Eliot, we can start with you.
So I think those are the reasons why people think that he would be okay. I think, to the extent that, particularly in the Orthodox community, you see more support for Trump than perhaps in other sections of the Jewish world, it is because his son-in-law is an Orthodox Jew and his daughter is a convert. And look, the Abraham Accords were a good thing, although what people tend not to know is that actually the initiative for that came from the United Arab Emirates. They have some extremely canny diplomats. And one of the things that makes a canny diplomat, as I've learned by experience, is they're very careful to give other people the credit. And that is exactly what they did. And moving the embassy, which is fine. I mean, I'm in favor of it. It's essentially symbolic. But the heart of it really does get to two things. One is, and Bill referenced this, the transactional nature of the approach to just about everything, but particularly to foreign policy. So the idea, which I think some people erroneously have, is, well, his commitment to Israel, that's from the heart, that's based on ideology. It's just in his views of how you deal with Britain and France and Germany and Japan, sort of longstanding Australia, longstanding allies. On those things, he's completely transactional. Well, I have news for you. If he's completely transactional about them, as he most definitely is, and by the way, also quite transactional in a very dangerous way with countries like China and North Korea and Hungary, which we don't want to associate with, sooner or later he'll be transactional about Israel as well. And then the second thing really does go to the flaws of character. As you know, if those of you who have access to something called the DSM, which is the official diagnostic manual for psychologists and psychiatrists out there, look up the definition of a narcissistic personality. And last time I checked, I think there were like 13 different tests, and 11 of them Trump met immediately. If you thought for 2 seconds about the other two, you'd say he meets those two. Somebody who is that narcissistic simply doesn't see others as anything other than tools, and that is how he will behave. Whereas I do believe with Kamala Harris that the connection to the Jewish community is real. It's of long standing. The commitment to Israel is real. Her engagement with the human and emotional consequences of October 7th is real. And I think she, would continue to be fundamentally supportive of Israel if, not uncritical. But then again, what has escaped people's notice to some extent is, Trump got very angry at Bibi Netanyahu. I forgot what the issue was, and he began lashing out at him after having been his best buddy for a while. So that's the real difference that you're looking at, and you simply cannot overestimate its importance.
Bill, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. And I would also say that a Trumpian world is not a good world for Israel. It might be in the very short term because it could be a good world for anyone, but it's all transactional. And if you're, using power in a way that doesn't offend Trump, and if you have some personal relationship, maybe, which Bibi sort of had and sort of has. So as Eliot says, he also lashes out. It's hard to know how deep that is, but Miriam Adelson can keep Trump maybe from being too hostile, but it's not a sound basis for anything. And it's ultimately dangerous for Israel. Israel is better off with a strong West, with strong alliances. The Europeans aren't always great on Israel, but you know what? It's important to have an American president who's able to steer the Europeans away from their worst instincts and towards better ones. And it does matter. If you talk to Israelis, it's easy here to be a very tough guy, and who cares about the EU? They're horrible, and they've always been anti-Semites in Europe, and now they're a bunch of lefties, which is a little bit true, honestly. But you know what? If you talk to the Israelis, they care what huge countries in Europe think about them and what their trade relations are and what their purchase of arms abilities are in those countries. And having an administration that can do its best to steer those countries in a good direction, to steer Asian countries in a good direction, to cooperate with Israel and all of that. Israel is a small country. It is not going to be safe in a dog-eat-dog world in which the U.S. is an unreliable partner and everyone else is just looking around, looking out for themselves too, because that's one effect of what effective Trump is in a way. So a Trumpy world is not good for Israel over the medium and long term. And just think practically, I mean, what if Netanyahu isn't prime minister 2 years from now, and it's I don't know, Gantz or Lapid or whoever. Who knows what they've said about it, Trump over the years. It's probably not all flattering. Someone will show it to Trump and suddenly he's got a very different attitude towards Israel. And it's not Ron Dermer and Bibi Netanyahu. It's two other people who are, fine, I would say, Israeli, centrists presumably, but not people who have the relationship with Trump or some of Trump's aides. So I think it's Trump's world is not a good world for Israel. It's not a good world for the Jews, really. Trump's America is not a good world for the Jews. I mean, if I could just get to that for a second, I mean, Jews benefit a lot from a deep liberal in the broad sense of liberal, which includes, Reaganite conservative over to Hubert Humphrey and Kamala Harris liberals. It's important to Jews to preserve the strength of liberal institutions and liberal norms and liberal practices in that broad sense in America. Trump has no commitment to any of that. And maybe for now he's beating up Haitians and he's demagoguing the most recent immigrants, but that's not a stable basis on which to assume that it doesn't turn against the Jews. And we've seen that he has no problem hanging out with people who genuinely are anti-Semites. I mean, and they're close to him. Tucker Carlson is not like a trivial figure. He's not like, I don't know, Kamala Harris is shaking hands, I'm sure, with Ilhan Omar because she's a Democratic member of Congress. Tucker, I don't think she's not a major advisor, to say the least, to Kamala Harris or to Joe Biden. And the people who are mainstream and either have, some cases, long records of being pro-Israel and in others records of being reasonable on Israel. Let's put it that way. Tucker Carlson is really a close advisor to, is close to Donald Trump. I mean, he's one of the 3 or 4 people who insisted on the Vance vice presidential pick. Some of these other people from Silicon Valley are not reliable friends of Israel, to say the least. And so, again, I think the degree to which a Trumpy America is not a safe, unfortunately, as safe an America for Jews and as welcoming in America as a more traditional America, either a traditional Reagan-Bush America or a traditional Clinton-Biden America. Those are both fine. And then we can quibble about some stuff on the margins, But Trump is outside of that framework. And that's an important, when you get outside that framework, history suggests things get pretty dangerous for Jews.
Mm-hmm. So we have a lot of questions from the audience, and I want to make sure we can get to some of those. But just before we do that, one last question for both of you. So for some reason, despite all the evidence we've discussed, there are some Jewish voters who, for whatever reason, are just nervous about Kamala Harris. They can't necessarily articulate why, but they just, in their kishkis and their gut, they just don't feel it. So, and conversely, contrary to all this proof, they say Trump, we feel that Trump is better for Israel. We feel that Trump's better for the Jews. Can you explain what's going on here and why should Jews feel confident in their support of Vice President Harris and Governor Walz over Donald Trump and JD Vance? And I'll just add here, there's been a lot of media recently, reports coming out from the White House about support for Israel militarily, the sending of the THAAD missile and the 100 American troops who will or missile system who operate the THAAD missile system, and just some of the things that the Biden-Harris administration has done for Israel and for countering Iran militarily. Maybe if there's a way to sort of talk about both of those things, I think we'd all be really interested to hear your perspective.
Well,
Eliot,
I'm not quite sure what to add beyond what I said, which is, I think that the points where Trump sort of established a relationship, it begins with the fact that he's a New York figure who surrounded himself with actually a fair number of Jews who worked for him. Now, an important thing to remember is he was quite happy to betray some of those people. I mean, probably the first and most important Jew to work for him was Roy Cohn, a real lowlife, if ever there was one, but who, as Trump himself said, really taught him how to swindle your way through life and make lots of money. Well, when Roy Cohn was lying on his deathbed from AIDS, he didn't hear a peep from Trump. Trump didn't pay him a visit, didn't drop him a note. And shortly before he died, you'll forgive my saying it, he said, Donald Trump pisses ice water. So in other words, this was a guy who had no human connection whatsoever. But the fact is, there are lots of Jews around Trump. Trump is a New York kind of figure. There are a lot of Jews in New York. And to some extent, even though I'm not originally a Bostonian, I will say that you know, the New York Jewish persona is one that's very familiar and to some extent comfortable for an awful lot of American Jews. Kamala Harris is from San Francisco. It's the West Coast. It's different. And it's also in the nature of things that I think as vice president, really you articulate the president's vision. You're not supposed to be making policy on your own. You contribute in private, but you are not the dominant figure. So I think there's a feeling that people have, they have a little bit less familiarity. But I do have to say, I marvel at the idea that anybody can kind of feel that, you know, I look into Donald Trump's soul and I know, you know, that he's really on my side. And that just seems to me, it seems to me preposterous. And it reminds me a little bit of there's, you know, somebody who I worked for and I, in most respects, admire quite a lot. George W. Bush said, you know, he looked deeply into Vladimir Putin's soul and thought he saw something there. And John McCain, who I knew quite well and admired a great deal, said, yeah, I looked into his soul and I saw KGB. And I think that's part of it. It's there's something about Trump that is, he's made it, I guess the last thing I'll say, this guy's made a whole career out of gulling people, you know, with his phony university, with his, you know, selling Bibles and gold sneakers and stuff like that, and lying, I mean, egregiously. He's good at it. I mean, he really is a very talented grifter. And I think, unfortunately, people are susceptible to that. And, you know, you might like to think the Jews are smarter than everybody else, but they're not. And they're susceptible, they're particularly susceptible to people saying, we love you. And Trump knows how to do that in just the right way, I think, to push the buttons and elicit a response. But it's a fraud. It's just one more fraud in a very, very long string of them.
Yeah, no, I think that's well said. You know, I just make two brief points. I mean, on the Trump side, the degree to which he's surrounded and the degree to which MAGA is populated by, and the degree to which the whole America First Project 2025 agenda is sort of populated by, and it will be implemented by people who are not friends of the Jewish people. Some of them are temporarily, but I mean, if you look at the Christian extremists who were on the mall here Saturday, I mean, I think because for various weird historical accidents, part of some aspects of current Christian messianism and extremism and apocalyptic thinking is vaguely pro-Israel in some sense. You know, what that's better than being anti-Israel, which is a practical matter. Okay, fine. But they're not reliable friends of Israel in the world that we're going to be living in, I believe. And a lot of what they do is just one step. They're sort of in check because it's become fashionable, and I know this from pretty close-up observation in the 2000s in the Republican Party to be pro-Israel, as Bush was, and McCain was, and Romney was, and the parts of the Christian right genuinely were, I'm going to say. But then all these other characters sort of vaguely think they're supposed to be pro-Israel, but they are not ultimately respectful of Israel as an independent, as the home of the Jewish people, as the Jewish and democratic state. They're not really respectful of either the Jewish or Democratic Party, I would say, and they're not, as I say, terribly respectful at all of the interests of Jews here in the U.S. You know, some of this new apostolic Reformation stuff, it's a little fringy, but you know what? They're going to be pretty important in the Trump education department and in various Trump parts of the Trump administration, and they're not nobody. And Michael Flynn is out there in a totally lunatic. I mean, they're blowing the show, and they were here on Saturday. It was Yom Kippur, obviously. They were blowing the shofar on the wall to show, and you know, and people took that in the media in a way. If you read some of the articles, credulously, you know, well, they're sort of pro-Israel. It's like, really, is it really to be? And they're there calling for atonement for they don't have anything to atone for. They don't think they want America to atone for having elected Joe Biden, I suppose. So, you know, I'm not a fan, or I'm not comfortable with what Trump world will look like in that respect. Conversely, look, Kamala Harris hasn't been. I mean, people got a little spoiled, honestly. Joe Biden, you know, he'd been around for 50 years, he'd been very active in foreign policy. Every Jewish leader knew him, and he worked for him, and he worked, you know, he worked with people who worked with him, Tony Blinken and so forth. I mean, you don't always get a president who has 50 years of foreign policy experience and who is honestly from the East Coast and who has spent a lot of time in politics dealing with Jews of all kinds, whether and foreign and Israeli prime ministers of all kinds. Biden loves to tell that story about Golda Meir. It's a little bit like, I remember I've seen him in audiences where he's told it, and it's like, that was before I was born. That was before my parents were born. People are watching. It's kind of one reason why it was probably wise that Biden didn't run again, But look, it's nice to have someone who knew and admired Golda Meir as president. Obviously, Harris is a whole different generation, a whole different background, and mostly a domestic politics background. She was active in foreign policy on the Armed Services Committee when she got to the Senate, but before that, she was a state official. So I don't think people are going to have that kind of warmth in a way that instinctively that they may have had for Biden. But I think it's very important in politics to get beyond that pretty quickly. I served in the first Bush administration. That was not a warm administration towards Israel. I think I can defend the policies. I think ultimately they did the right thing. And I could even make a case that they did more than they get credit for. But there were a lot of fights between Bush and Baker and Shamir and so forth. And there wasn't a warm and fuzzy relationship with Israel. George W. Bush really was very different, as Eliot knows well. And he really was, I think, felt in his heart a kind of close affiliation with Israel. But at the end of the day, politicians, what they feel in their heart, come and go, and you do have to judge by the policies. And I think Biden's policy, and this he does not get, I'll just close with this, Eliot touched on it, but just to be clear, he does not get enough credit for standing with Israel during a very rough war. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. There were civilian casualties in Gaza, and probably Israel did a few things that maybe they might have thought differently about doing in retrospect. In the way they fought that war. On the other hand, in general, I think it's very impressive, and there was a lot of attention to civilians, the casualties. Anyway, it would be easy to have really found occasions to really put pressure on Israel to stop or not to do what they felt they had to do. And God knows Netanyahu was not personally popular with Bibi, and there were some reasons for that. Some of them were probably good reasons with Biden, and some of those reasons were good reasons on Biden's part, if we could be honest. And they did not. I mean, they held up one shipment of arms for, I don't know, a few weeks or something. And they did a lot of stuff behind the scenes, like every American administration has done when Israel has been at war. And at times, one chafes a little bit at it, and at times maybe they were mistaken. But on the whole, when historians look at this, compared to 73 with Nixon, 67 certainly with Johnson, 82 with Reagan, and I defer to Eliot on this, but I would say compared to 2006 in Lebanon, or 2014 with Obama and Gaza, this Biden administration was more supportive, more unequivocally supportive, stayed the course in supporting, and is still staying the course in supporting. If you had told any of us, incidentally, on October 6th, this is going to happen, and they're going to go to war in Gaza, I think Eliot and I probably would have said, well, that's great. I hope Bibi has this plan to do this in 2 or 3 months, because after 2 or 3 months, U.S. administrations usually do not find it too hard diplomatically and for other reasons to keep on supporting an Israeli effort that is, difficult and that is, as I say, causing some backlash around the world and so forth. And Biden's been very good on this. And Harris, so far as I know, has been very good at encouraging Biden to stay very good on this and certainly supportive of what Biden's been doing. So that's something we don't get enough credit for.
Thank you both so much for those answers. Before I turn it over to the audience, I would just like to briefly reintroduce Halie Soifer, the CEO of JDCA. Before joining JDCA, Halie served for nearly 2 decades as a national security advisor, both in the Obama administration and to 4 members of Congress, including Senator Chris Coons and then Senator Kamala Harris. So Halie will lead the audience Q&A with our panelists. Halie, over to you.
Great, thank you. Well, I've been looking at the very active chat as well as the emails that you have sent. Message received. One of the messages that we are getting is that we are talking about many reasons why we as Jews should not be supporting Donald Trump, and we'll get into some more of those. But one of the things that I'm hearing is, but why support Kamala Harris? And we're going to put in the chat a new document that JDCA has just come out with, which focuses specifically on 3 issues and makes exactly that case: on Israel, on Iran, and on anti-Semitism. But because I have this personal experience having served as National Security Advisor for then Senator Harris, I can say unequivocally that now Vice President Harris is a staunch supporter of the U.S.-Israel relationship, of Israel, and she came to this White House with those views. I saw it firsthand when I worked for her in the Senate in 2017 and 18, traveled to Israel with her and the second gentleman in 2017. She has a deep commitment to the U.S.-Israel security relationship, the military relationship, and is committed to ensuring and has provided repeat assurances that Israel has what it needs to continue to defend itself against the Iranian threat and against Iranian proxies. So we will post in the chat for you the bullets that we have put together on these issues, and we'll continue to get to your questions. This one is for you, Eliot. In the past day, we've heard from the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mike Milley, who apparently told Bob Woodward that he had suspicions about Trump's mental decline, but now he realizes that Donald Trump is a total fascist. What would it mean for the United States of America to have a fascist as president? How would we be seen in the world, and how might it impact our national security?
So, actually, first, if I could just jump in, we have a choice. The choice is between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. One of them will be president at the end of the day. And I think even people who are not entirely comfortable that they know everything they want to know about Kamala Harris, that's your choice. The dangers of Trump, I think, are considerable. I mean, fascism actually implies more organization than I think Trump has. But what I think you would see is, first, a tremendous amount of internal turmoil in the United States, because I do believe he would be vindictive. I do believe he would try to turn loose the IRS and the FBI. He said he would. And on this one, I believe him. And by and large, I think Jews should believe what people say. When they threaten to do terrible things, Jews have never made a mistake by believing people threatening to do terrible things. That's what our history teaches us. Internationally, it would be a calamity. I mean, we know where he stands on Ukraine. This is, of course, separate from Israel issues, although it's not separate from Jewish issues. It's no coincidence that the chief rabbi of Moscow is in Tel Aviv, and the chief rabbi of Ukraine is mourning the loss of his son, who died on the front lines fighting for Ukraine's freedom. I think it's clear a Trump administration would abandon Ukraine. This would be a devastating blow to our most important alliance of all, NATO, which has helped keep the peace in Europe for something like 75 years. I think there would be all kinds of openings for Iran, for China, for Russia, for North Korea, in part because they know that they could approach Trump in a transactional way and at least begin to get him hooked. That was sort of the story with North Korea. And I want to emphasize this point. One of the things I've been writing about in The Atlantic and some longer things as well is we're entering a world now where there are 4 states which are really aligned against us: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. They are increasingly cooperating. They are sharing technology. There's even, to some extent, troops going back and forth. There are North Korean soldiers now approaching the Ukrainian front. This is an extraordinarily dangerous time for the United States. We have not seen a threat of this kind since World War II. It really is that severe. And although I've been critical of the Biden administration for doing less than I would like to see, the fact of the matter is that a Trump administration, I think, would be infinitely more dangerous, in part because it would blow up what has really been the crown jewel of our strategic posture in the world, and that is our alliance system. That's been true really since 1940, when we began forging the alliance with Britain that eventually helped us win World War II. And I think that would be blown up. And so I think the result would be a chaotic United States. We would maybe get through it somehow, but after the wreckage was cleared in 4 or 8 or 12 years, and we looked around the parapet, it would be a very different world. Last thing I'll just say on that one, a very different world in which, when people realize that you can't rely on the United States, you either side with the bad guys or you decide that you're going to get nuclear weapons. And either one, I think, promises chaos and actually eventually the outbreak of much larger wars, which would include the use of nuclear weapons. I think we need to take that very, very seriously. So I think there's this is an extremely weighty choice. And even though, I will probably be saying a Harris-Walz administration should be doing more, there's no question in my mind that their basic direction would be the right one. And there's no doubt in my mind that the basic direction in the Trump administration would be the wrong one.
Thank you.
Can I just add one footnote? I mean, Eliot mentioned Iran. Iran is one of these four countries in the axis of dictatorships and of aggression. Trump, was sort of tough on Iran, depending on how you think about it. Maybe not very effectively so, but I noticed that in 2024, maybe after some of these private conversations with Putin that he may have had from Mar-a-Lago, suddenly Trump's talking about we have to have a deal with Iran. I mean, this is where, again, you can't count on anything with Trump. And if Trump wants to get along with Putin, which he certainly does, he'll certainly sell it on, tragically, Ukraine, I'm afraid. But also, suddenly he could change his attitude towards Iran. And God knows what money could change hands with Iran, as it has with other countries, right? If the Saudis are being very generous to the Trump family, that's in the short term okay for Israel, because the Saudis are in the short term mostly okay for Israel. But again, it's not like Iran doesn't have money to give out either. So, and China and Russia. And so I think the degree of danger, Eliot's very right about the broader danger, but even in the short term, the degree to which Trump's transactionalism trumps, any assurance that he could be pretty good for Israel is striking. And just one quick point on, because I get this all the time too. Harris, how do we know? Really, is she really as good as she could be? No, you know what? She probably isn't quite as good as she could be. Who is as good as they could be, really, in the real world? George W. Bush did things that Israel didn't like. Barack Obama certainly had major fights with the Israeli government. Biden has privately, apparently, expressed great exasperation with Netanyahu. Reagan. I mean, it's just, you can't make the perfect be the enemy of the good. I was thinking about Bush since I was in the first Bush White House, and he, as I say, didn't have warm relations with Israel, though I think did the right thing with Israel. But he ran against Clinton, and of course Clinton was very good, convincingly could convincingly say to the Jewish community that I'm a more natural friend of Israel. And I remember being in JCCs around the country trying to make the case for George H.W. Bush against Bill Clinton, which was not the easiest thing in the world to do. But you know what? That would be a perfectly fine choice for Israel. And I think every serious Israeli statesman from the time, Moshe Aarons and others, Zalman Shoval, would say, we can live with either government. We have maybe slight preferences. This is the equivalent, but in that year of 1992, I'll know those of you who were around back then remember this. There was another candidate running for president whom we beat, luckily in the primary, Pat Buchanan. What this is to say that, gee, I got some qualms about Harris, so should I support him against Trump, would be like saying I have qualms about George H.W. Bush, so should I support him against Pat Buchanan? It is, it's black and white in my opinion in that respect. And the fact that, or maybe it's, let's say it's black and then white and off-white and creamy white or whatever all those colors are the painters could give you a choice of. And as I say, Harris may not be entirely perfect from some people's point of view, but I very much agree with Eliot. Directionally, it's just fundamentally different, and Harris is on the right side of this directional vector, and Trump is on the Buchanan side.
Great. Well, we'll ask one more question to each of you. Eliot, just picking up on the topic that Bill was discussing, specifically Iran. We've gotten a lot of questions about Iran. The basic theme is Vice President Harris going to be tough enough on Iran? And in answering that, I must also say that there's some disinformation in the chat. For example, someone asked about the Biden administration's refusal to enforce sanctions against Iran. The reality is they've kept in place all of the Trump administration sanctions on Iran. They've added about 700 additional sanctions on Iran. And it was Donald Trump, when speaking last month at the Economic Club of New York, who suggested that he would lift sanctions on Iran and Russia. So, Eliot, the question is, will Kamala Harris be tough enough on Iran? And I think it's important to talk about Russia in this context as well, and Donald Trump's clear alignment with Vladimir Putin and Russia's alignment with Iran.
So I would say the chances are much better. I think you're right to highlight the Russia connection. I mean, as I'm sure most people know, the Iranians are helping to provide the Russians with drones, with missiles now, including some of their latest solid-fueled missiles, which are particularly dangerous. If the if a Trump administration really establishes warm relations with Russia, that gets much worse, actually. So there's definitely that. Look, I think as I said, a Trump administration will be open to any kind of deal. He will be hungry to cut deals with the Iranians, with the North Koreans, with the Chinese, all of which will be very, very bad deals, including very bad deals, I think, for Israel. No administration, Republican or Democrat, including the two Republican administrations I served in, has really figured out how to deal with the Iranian nuclear program. We've known about that for a very, very long time. The very hard decision that I believe any administration has to face is, are you willing to do something about it of a direct and kinetic nature? I don't know whether Kamala Harris will be willing to do that. I'm quite sure Donald Trump would not be. I also think that Trump doesn't care about the nature of the regime that people live under. But the key to the Iranian problem is actually, it's not even their nuclear program solely. It's the nature of the Iranian regime, which is a revolutionary regime where hostility to the United States and hostility to Israel are the basic DNA. We're the greater Satan, the Israelis are the lesser Satan. He couldn't care less about any of that. I think for a number of reasons, I think Kamala Harris does care much more about that regime for a whole bunch of reasons. One of the reasons, I think, by the way, is status of women. That is, and that's an important tell, frankly, when you look at any society. How do they treat women? But I think he wouldn't care about that, and he would be open to a very transactional, very bad deal. Last thing I'll say is, let's remember, Donald Trump has made loads and loads of really bad deals. Somehow the idea that he's a good deal maker, it's a fraud like most of the rest of his business life. So I think I have higher confidence in Kamala Harris. Like Bill, I've been around too long to have absolute confidence in any politician, but I know where there's a huge delta. And there is an enormous delta here between what I think Kamala Harris will do and what I think Donald Trump will do.
Bill, last questions for you. Focusing on the questions that we received about domestic policy issues, specifically starting with our democracy. And I know that you have discussed this at length in terms of the unique threat that Donald Trump poses to our democracy. Why should American Jews be uniquely concerned about Trump's attack on our democracy? And I would add to this, in terms of domestic policy, we've also been asked about what's the economic case to make in support of Harris. And I would also, if you can, weave in immigration.
I'll be brief. These are all big questions. On the economic case, I have conversations with Bill Kristol, with Jason Furman, who was Obama's CAA chief, teaches the EC10, the Economics 10 course at Harvard. Very clear, good teacher. Sure, I've taken that course, obviously from him, but took it back in the day. And very good explanation and kind of non-polemical explanation of the economic policies of the Harris administration and the Trump administration. Harris administration, he says, will be Biden a little less so, sort of, because there won't be the pandemic, so you won't have this big spending spurt at the beginning. She's doesn't have the traditional labor attachments, honestly, that Biden has. So probably a little friendlier to kind of business startups and so forth, but it'll be a mainstream Democratic administration. Trump will be erratic and he's promising tax breaks to everyone now. But the main thing I would say is the tariffs. People do not, and Jason goes on at some length about this. It's really worth listening to that part. Trump, the one thing Trump believes in, and always has, is tariffs. And if you watch him out there, he's just over and over talking about how not just tariffs on China, some of which might be defensible for national security reasons, but a 10% across the board tariff. That is a huge tax increase, a huge price increase for everyone. It's foolish policy. It's dangerous policy because it leads to retaliation. As I was saying earlier today in another podcast, Trump seems to have adopted like every bad idea from American history and made it his own. And we haven't and we'll see the consequences of that if he becomes president. America First is a very bad foreign policy idea. Smoot-Hawley tariffs is a very bad domestic policy idea, which of course became a foreign international economic disaster in the 30s. And so I think he's got this because he didn't really do some of what he said he was going to do in his first term, and because we were continuing the Obama recovery, and maybe some of the tax cuts helped a little bit, some of the others not so much, and because he was kept in line by Gary Cohen and others. The first term of Trump was not a disaster economically. It wasn't quite as good as Biden, but it wasn't a disaster. But I don't think you can count on that in the second term. Immigration policy, I mean, the mean-spiritedness there, I think, should be intolerable to Jews. And I find it personally just so repulsive the way he's demagoguing immigrants. And I think it's bad for the country. If you want economic growth in America, we want more immigrants, and we don't want to shut down we don't want to deport 15 million people. That's another thing. He's explicitly and very unembarrassedly now apparently for deporting 15 million people. Many of whom have lived here for decades, many of whom have children who are American citizens. They were born here. Some of them are married to American citizens, but they're, quote, illegal. So there's no DACA, no path to citizenship, no path to even permanent worker status. And that's both inhumane and extremely foolish in terms of the economy. And if he ever tried to do it, it would cause a huge amount of civil unrest in this country. So now people don't take it quite seriously. And JD Vance is saying, well, maybe only 1 million a year. Really? We can deport 1 million Americans? This is not people at the border who we're not going to let in, or we're going to, send her back right away. These are people who've been living here for years. Is that the kind of America we want to live in? Have Jews done well in an America that has highly restrictive immigration policies and is even interested in throwing out some people whom they don't like? So I don't think so. And finally, just broadly, Trump has obviously total contempt for the rule of law. The whole idea of the Project 2025 stuff, Schedule F, the way no restraints on using the Justice Department to go after enemies, and no restraint on monkeying around with the Defense Department and military in terms of everything from promotions to policies. No orderly process where people get to review changes in policies. I mean, all of that is bad for the country. It's also bad for minority groups. Jews have done very well, partly because we have a pretty strong rule of law. You don't get to come in and say, I don't like those Jewish businesses over there. Those guys didn't help me out. I want you to go after them, IRS. I don't want you to go after them, antitrust. I mean, does that happen in American history? Yes. Does that routinely happen in modern America? No. And actually, we take it for granted. It's not. I've been audited, I got only once or twice by the IRS. It never occurred to me, well, gee, that's because I've either been critical of the administration and power or because I'm Jewish. But I don't know. You can't count on that with Trump at all. And I think, and again, it's less that he's going to target Jews, quad Jews, but the people whom he targets who've been critical of him, the foundations, the think tanks, the universities, some of the individuals, a lot of them are actually sort of populated by Jews. So just from a very sort of narrow self-interest point of view, I don't think this is the reason to not vote for Trump. But I do think a lot of these policies would actually adversely affect Jews. But more importantly, they would damage the country and a system of the rule of law and a nonpartisan civil service and a military that promotes by merit, or at least not by prejudice, let's put it that way, that's been very good for the Jewish people in America. And so I think I really think there's a lot to worry about. And people are underestimating, how dangerous it would be. It's not that on the day one, we're going to become hungry, It's not that he's suddenly going to destroy the massive institutions we have, the bar and the civil society and universities and the media and churches and synagogues and mosques and everything else we have in America that are barriers in a way to this kind of personal dictatorial government. But that could get eroded faster than people think. And 4 years is a long time. And he'll have a Congress that will not stop him in the first 2 years. If Trump wins the presidency, there'll certainly be a Republican Senate. And I would think if he wins the presidency, probably a Republican House. And even if there's not, limit how much Congress can do to stop him. And if there's a Republican Congress, they won't even try to stop him. So I think the degree to which things we have taken for granted in modern America can really be eroded in a very dangerous way. That's what strikes me about the threat of Trump.
Absolutely. And because more than one person asked about Kamala Harris's position with regard to anti-Semitism on campus, I will just repeat for everyone what she told Jewish leaders around the country when she had a high holiday call just on Friday. She said, when individuals participate in calls to violence and harassment against Jews, that is anti-Semitism, and I condemn it. When Jews are targeted because of their beliefs or identity, and when Israel is singled out because of anti-Jewish hatred, that is anti-Semitism, and I condemn it. Each university must ensure all students and faculty are safe and secure on campus. So that is Kamala Harris this past Friday. With regard to anti-Semitism. We could keep going for hours, but we wanted to keep this somewhat on time and end it after 1 hour. So thank you so much to our panelists. And to wrap us up, I'm going to turn it over to our Chief Program Officer, Bobby Saferstein, to let us know how we can ensure that Kamala Harris wins in just 22 days. Bobby.
Thanks, Halie, and thanks to Bill and Eliot and Sarah, and to each of you for tuning in today for this important conversation on why Jewish conservatives are voting for Vice President Kamala Harris. There's something incredibly powerful when the final month of a presidential election lines up with the Yamim Noraim, or the days of awe. Everything just hits differently because all of the sights and sounds and beautiful imagery evoked in our liturgy with hopes and wishes for a sweet new year and a better future are very much grounded in reality. Because over the course of the next 22 days, we have the power to directly shape what that better future looks like. As we've heard today from some of the most respected and principled Jewish conservative voices, the best way forward for the United States, Israel, and the Jewish people is to elect Kamala Harris. But it's going to take all of us, Democrats, independents, Republicans, liberals, and conservatives alike, to ensure that happens. We hope you do so with JDCA. To learn more about how you can take action, please visit jewishdems.org/do-something. Sign up to phone bank with us, text bank with us, and canvass with us around the country, including in key swing states such as Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. To sign up to travel with JDCA, to knock on doors and help close those margins, please click on the link in the chat. We also encourage you to sign up for our future events, join one of our state and local chapters and affiliates, and make a financial contribution to support our work. This is the most consequential election of our lifetime. So let's turn our days of awe into days of action and build a better tomorrow by electing Kamala Harris as our next president. Thank you for joining JDCA in all of our efforts. Wishing each of you an early Chag Sukkot Sameach, and see you soon.